The story begins not with a wedding, but with the crack of a rusted lock. In the spring of 2023, during the renovation of an abandoned chapel near Ravenshade, Texas, a construction crew stumbled upon a chest hidden beneath the chapel's warped floorboards. The chest was no larger than a coffin for a child, its hinges corroded, and its lid stained dark with water and time. When pried open, the air that escaped smelled of mildew and old paper, a breath of history exhaling after nearly 2 centuries. Inside, wrapped in decaying linen, lay a collection of letters, a delicate lace glove, and something far more disturbing, a fragment of what could only be described as a torn wedding veil, still faintly stained with what looked like dried blood. The letters, written in an elegant but fading hand, bore the date March 18, 1838. Most were addressed to Eleanor Whitlock, a name that locals knew well but whispered as though invoking a curse. Eleanor, they said, was the bride who never left her wedding day. Some stories claimed she was buried alive in her wedding dress. Others insisted her death was the result of something far darker, a betrayal by those closest to her. When fragments of the letters were read aloud during a town council meeting, witnesses described an unshakable chill in the room. One letter, signed simply C.W., read, "Forgive me, my sweet Eleanor, for by the time these words find your hands, your heart may already be silent. They told me this was the only way." The letters hinted at deceit, fear, and an unspoken horror that the Whitlock family had tried to bury, both figuratively and literally. The chapel where the chest was found once stood at the edge of the Whitlock estate, and locals now believe it was here, under the gaze of the wooden cross and flickering candles, that Eleanor's tragic story reached its end. The legend of the bride buried in white has haunted the town of Ravenshade for nearly 2 centuries, but these letters provide more than mere whispers. They give voice to a story too grotesque and sorrowful to be forgotten. Imagine standing in that chapel, hearing the wind rattle the broken windows, and knowing that beneath your feet lay the final remnants of a young woman's life, a life cut short on the day it was meant to begin. Tonight, we reveal what really happened to Eleanor Whitlock. This story isn't for everyone. It is for those who can stomach the weight of old secrets and the chilling certainty that some souls do not rest, no matter how deep the grave. What would you do if you uncovered a box of letters that spoke of betrayal, death, and screams that no one heard? Would you read them all, or burn them and try to forget? As we unravel the tale of Eleanor's final day, we will peel back layers of history, corruption, and cruelty that stretch far beyond a single wedding. But before we go further, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Texas? Somewhere further away? Let us know in the comments as we step into the shadows of 1838. Where a veil of lace became a shroud of death. To understand Eleanor Whitlock's tragic fate, we must first step back into Texas as it stood in 1838, a land raw and untamed, where beauty and danger coexisted in equal measure. Texas was not yet a state, but a young republic, freshly carved out of blood and rebellion. It was a place of opportunity for some and a harsh wilderness for others, where law was dictated by the barrel of a gun, and whispers of superstition were as common as the dry winds that howled across the plains. Ravenshade, the small settlement where Eleanor lived, lay on the edge of what many called the wild borderlands. It was a town built by ambition and desperation. Dusty wooden homes, a single saloon, a church, and scattered ranches standing like lonely outposts against the horizon. Life here was not just fragile, but fleeting. Illness, drought, and violence could strike without warning, and the people of Ravenshade learned quickly to cling to their traditions and faith as shields against the unknown. Death held a different weight in 1838. Funerary rituals were intimate, often performed by candlelight in the presence of grieving families. Superstitions ran deep. Mirrors were covered to prevent souls from being trapped. Bells were tolled to keep spirits from wandering, and corpses were watched closely for fear of the dead who might not truly be dead. Cases of premature burial were whispered about. Tales of clawed coffins and scratch marks that left entire communities terrified of being buried alive. Against this backdrop, a wedding was meant to be a beacon of life, a rare moment of hope. The union of 2 families was celebrated not just with joy, but with the unspoken belief that marriage offered protection against the harsh realities of frontier life. A wedding dress, especially one as fine as Eleanor Whitlock's, was both a symbol of purity and a kind of armor, sewn with the expectation of blessings, children, and long life. But for Eleanor, that promise would turn to ashes before the vows were ever completed. Ravenshade's people were suspicious of outsiders, but even more suspicious of the unexplained. The land itself seemed to conspire against them. Storms could appear without warning, crops would fail overnight, and livestock would vanish under strange circumstances. In such a place, every tragedy took on the weight of legend, every untimely death becoming a ghost story whispered over the crackle of a fire. It is within this unforgiving world that Eleanor's story begins. She was the daughter of Samuel Whitlock, a powerful ranch owner who believed wealth and influence could shield his family from misfortune. But money and cattle offered no protection against the eerie hand of fate, or the darkness festering within the walls of the Whitlock household. In 1838 Texas, the line between life and death was as thin as the lace on a wedding veil. When Eleanor collapsed on her wedding day, many believed it to be the work of bad omens rather than science or illness. Medicine was crude and uncertain. Physicians were often no more than well-read gamblers, diagnosing with as much guesswork as knowledge. The world Eleanor lived in was one where faith collided with fear, and superstition was as strong as scripture. That very collision would decide her fate. The morning of March 18, 1838, began with sunlight spilling over the dusty plains of Ravenshade. But inside the Whitlock homestead, the air was heavy, as if the house itself sensed the doom about to unfold. Eleanor Whitlock, just 19 years old, stood before her mirror in a room that smelled faintly of roses and cold iron. Her wedding dress, a flowing gown of pale ivory with intricate lace sleeves, hung from her shoulders like a shroud waiting to claim her. Though it was meant to symbolize purity and new beginnings, Eleanor's reflection told another story. Her face was pale, her lips colorless, and her eyes held a silent fear she dared not voice. According to the letters discovered beneath the chapel floorboards, Eleanor had been uneasy for weeks leading up to her wedding. Her diary entries, written in a graceful but hurried script, spoke of unending dread and a coldness in her heart. In one haunting note dated just days before the ceremony, she wrote, "I hear footsteps when I am alone. I feel as though someone watches me even in my dreams. I am to be married, but I do not feel alive. I feel hunted." Her fiancé, Charles Whitlock, was a distant cousin, almost 20 years her senior, a stern man with sharp features and a reputation for cruelty masked beneath the veil of respectability. He was known in Ravenshade as a shrewd landowner who expanded his influence by swallowing smaller ranches through intimidation and deceit. To many, this marriage was less about love and more about power, an unholy contract meant to bind Eleanor's inheritance to the Whitlock name. On the day of the wedding, the Whitlock estate buzzed with forced celebration. Servants rushed about, their faces drawn, as though they feared something would go wrong. Guests gathered beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds, whispering among themselves about Eleanor's appearance. Some claimed she looked as pale as death, while others murmured that she hadn't eaten for days. Eleanor's mother, Martha Whitlock, was seen clutching Eleanor's hands, her voice trembling as she said, "Do this for the family, my darling. Everything depends on you." It was as if Martha knew this union was a chain rather than a promise. As the ceremony drew near, Eleanor's hands shook so violently that her maid of honor, a young woman named Sarah Finch, had to button the back of her gown. Sarah would later write in a letter to her sister, "She looked at me with eyes that didn't seem her own. I swear for a moment I thought she wanted to run, but her feet were rooted as though nailed to the floor." The church bell rang, echoing across the barren fields, summoning the guests to witness what should have been a joyous occasion. Eleanor stepped out of the Whitlock home, her veil billowing like a ghostly wisp in the wind. The sound of her silk shoes on the wooden porch was described by one onlooker as the sound of a soul walking toward its grave. But there was something more, something that no one could quite explain. A flock of crows had gathered in the trees around the chapel, their harsh cries breaking through the tense silence. An old farmer who attended the wedding later said, "When I saw them blackbirds circling above, I knew something bad was coming. Those birds knew before any of us." By mid-afternoon, the skies darkened, and an unexpected storm rolled in, drenching the dusty ground. Thunder rumbled as the first hymn began inside the chapel. Eleanor, pale and trembling, walked down the aisle toward Charles, her hands cold to the touch. But fate, or something far darker, was already in motion. The chapel of Ravenshade stood like a weathered sentinel against the rolling plains, its wooden walls creaking under the weight of the storm. Inside, the pews were filled with townsfolk, their faces lit by flickering candles that bent and twisted in the damp, restless air. The scent of wet earth and melting wax filled the room, mingling with the fragrance of lilies that lined the aisle. It should have been a day of celebration, yet an uneasy silence lingered beneath the murmur of whispered prayers. Eleanor Whitlock appeared in the doorway, veiled and trembling. Her dress, a masterpiece of hand-sewn lace and silk, seemed too heavy for her frail frame. As she stepped forward, the hem of her gown brushed the wet floorboards, leaving faint, dark streaks of mud, a symbol perhaps of the grave dirt that would soon claim her. Guests glanced at each other, sensing something unnatural. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was a beauty shadowed by fear. Charles Whitlock stood at the altar like a statue carved from iron, his black coat gleaming in the candlelight. He smiled, but it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. To many, he looked less like a groom and more like a man standing over a prize he had already won. The Whitlock family sat in the front pews, their faces expressionless, their silence heavy with expectation. The ceremony began. The Reverend's voice trembled slightly, either from age or from the oppressive feeling that weighed on everyone in the room. Thunder cracked overhead, rattling the stained glass windows. A few guests claimed that Eleanor flinched every time the thunder rolled, her lips whispering something beneath her breath, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a plea. Halfway through the vows, Sarah Finch, Eleanor's maid of honor, noticed something strange. Eleanor's breathing grew shallow, her chest rising and falling rapidly beneath the tight corset of her gown. Her gloved hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet, white knuckles pressing through the delicate fabric. Sarah later wrote, "I wanted to call out, to tell them to stop, but everyone was watching Charles, not Eleanor. I could see the life draining from her face." Then, without warning, Eleanor swayed, her veil fluttering like a ghost in the breeze from the open chapel doors. Her bouquet slipped from her hands, scattering white petals across the aisle. A gasp swept through the crowd as she crumpled, her body striking the wooden floor with a hollow thud. For a moment silence reigned, broken only by the sharp patter of rain on the roof. The town's physician, Dr. Alcott, rushed to her side. His face paled as he pressed his fingers to her neck. "She's gone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The bride is gone." Gasps turned into frantic whispers. Some believed it was the work of a fever or exhaustion, but others began muttering about curses, how no union built on greed could bring life. Charles's reaction was chillingly cold. He did not cry out or kneel beside her. Instead, he stood silently, jaw clenched, as if her sudden death was not a tragedy, but an inconvenience. The storm outside raged on, and as lightning lit the windows, several guests swore they saw a shadow cross Eleanor's still face, a fleeting flicker, like a soul fighting to hold on. But within an hour, arrangements were already being made. Charles insisted on a swift burial, against the protests of a few relatives who begged to wait until morning. The wedding had ended, not with vows, but with the first nails being hammered into a coffin. The sudden collapse of Eleanor Whitlock turned what was meant to be a sacred celebration into a spectacle of confusion and fear. The chapel, moments ago filled with murmurs of blessings, now echoed with frantic whispers. Eleanor lay motionless on the floor, her white dress pooling around her like a wilted flower. A single candle flickered near her head, casting shadows that made her pale face appear almost skeletal. Dr. Jonathan Alcott, the town's only physician, knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life. He pressed his fingers against her neck, his brow furrowing. After a long pause, he shook his head and muttered, "Her pulse. It's gone." His words cut through the chapel like a blade, but the truth was less certain than his voice suggested. In 1838, medicine was primitive. Doctors lacked proper tools to detect shallow breathing or cataleptic states, conditions where a living person could appear lifeless. What might have been a faint heartbeat could easily go unnoticed. In the dim light, with the storm hammering the windows, Dr. Alcott's declaration was taken as fact. Charles Whitlock, Eleanor's groom, stood over her body like a shadow, his eyes cold and unyielding. He did not weep, nor did he kneel to cradle her lifeless form. Instead, he turned to Dr. Alcott and spoke with unsettling calm. Then she must be laid to rest at once. The townsfolk gasped. It was tradition in Ravenshade to keep the body of the deceased for at least a day, both to allow proper mourning and to ensure the soul had truly departed. But Charles insisted on immediate burial, citing the storm and the will of God as his reasoning. Eleanor's mother, Martha, broke into sobs. "She's just a child. Let her rest a night before you take her from us." Charles silenced her with a glare. "She is my wife," he said flatly, "and I will see to her resting place." The guests left the chapel in stunned silence, their boots splashing through puddles as the rain came down in sheets. Only a few stayed behind to help prepare Eleanor's body. Sarah Finch, her maid of honor, was among them. She later wrote to her sister, "I thought I saw her lips quiver when I touched her hand. It was so cold, yet not like death. Something in me wanted to scream at them to wait, but who was I to defy Charles Whitlock?" The preparations were rushed. Eleanor was dressed in her wedding gown as tradition dictated, but there was something cruel about the way it was done. Her veil was draped over her still face, the lace clinging to her lips as though she was gasping for air beneath it. The coffin was built hastily from pine planks, hammered together while thunder growled in the distance. Every nail struck into the wood felt like a drumbeat of finality. Sarah, standing by, swore she saw Eleanor's fingers twitch as they folded them over her bouquet. When she mentioned it to Dr. Alcott, he dismissed her, saying, "It's just the muscles releasing. She's gone, child. Let her be." But was she truly gone? The question would haunt Ravenshade for generations. For as the coffin was sealed and carried into the wet earth, a few bystanders swore they heard something, a faint scratching sound, so soft it could have been mistaken for the rain tapping on the lid. And yet the burial went on. The storm raged. The gravediggers lowered her into the ground, and with every shovelful of dirt, the truth, whether she was alive or dead, was buried with her. The storm had not yet passed when Eleanor Whitlock was lowered into the earth. Midnight was approaching, and the rain turned the cemetery grounds into a swamp of mud and shadow. The Whitlock family, draped in black, despite the fact that hours earlier they had dressed for a wedding, stood grimly under oil lamps that hissed in the wind. Their silence was as heavy as the storm clouds overhead. Charles Whitlock stood closest to the open grave, his hand resting on the wooden coffin as if to claim her even in death. The white of Eleanor's wedding dress glowed faintly under the lamplight where it peeked through the small glass viewing panel on the coffin's lid. That gown, once a symbol of innocence and joy, now looked like a cruel reminder of what had been stolen from her. The veil still covered her face, thin enough that one could almost imagine her chest rising, as though she was breathing beneath it. The Reverend's voice trembled as he recited the burial rites. His words were nearly drowned out by the sound of rain pelting the coffin and the rustle of trees swaying in the wind. A gravedigger named Thomas recalled later that he felt something wrong that night. Like the ground itself didn't want her, he would tell a fellow laborer years after. Sarah Finch, Eleanor's maid of honor, was the only one who dared to linger close to the grave. Her cheeks were streaked with tears and rain. In a letter she wrote afterwards, she confessed, "When they laid her down, I heard the faintest sound, like fingertips brushing wood. I tried to tell them, but Charles glared at me with such anger that I froze. I've never forgiven myself." Charles was impatient to see the burial completed. He barked orders at the gravediggers, insisting they finish quickly despite the mud slowing their shovels. "Get on with it," he said coldly, his voice cutting through the storm. To him, the faster Eleanor was sealed beneath the ground, the better. The first shovelful of wet dirt hit the coffin with a dull, heavy thud. Sarah flinched at the sound, her lips parting as if to protest, but the Reverend placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Let her rest, child," he whispered, though his voice carried little conviction. As the grave filled, lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in harsh white flashes. For an instant, Eleanor's pale hand, visible through the small glass panel, seemed to twitch. Thomas, the gravedigger, paused, his eyes wide, but Charles snapped, "It's the rain. Keep digging." By the time the final mound of earth was packed down, the storm had begun to quiet. The Whitlock family left in silence, their oil lamps disappearing one by one into the night. Only Sarah remained for a few moments longer, kneeling beside the fresh grave, her tears falling onto the mud. She swore she heard a faint sound beneath her feet, a soft tapping, almost like fingernails on wood. When she told the others, they dismissed her claims as grief-induced hysteria, but deep down, Sarah knew what she had heard. Something in Eleanor was still alive that night. Whether it was her soul or her body, no one would ever know for certain. In the days following Eleanor Whitlock's burial, Ravenshade fell eerily silent. Weddings were supposed to bring life to the town, a reason for laughter, dancing, and candlelight spilling onto the dirt roads. Instead, Eleanor's wedding had ended with a grave dug under storm-choked skies, and the people of Ravenshade couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had occurred. The first whispers began only 3 nights after her burial. A young boy named Jacob, who lived near the edge of the Whitlock property, claimed he saw a figure standing by the churchyard at dusk. She was dressed in white, he told his mother, eyes wide with fear. Her face was pale, and she didn't move when I called out. She just stared. His mother scolded him for talking nonsense, but his story spread quickly among the townsfolk. By the end of the week, others began to report strange happenings. Some claimed to hear soft scratching sounds near Eleanor's grave, as though something, or someone, was trying to claw its way out. Others swore they heard a faint, muffled crying whenever the wind blew across the cemetery at night. A ranch hand named Elias Turner described hearing what sounded like knuckles rapping against wood. I was delivering feed past midnight, he said years later, and I heard it clear as day, a knocking like someone begging to be let out. I'll never forget it. Sarah Finch, still haunted by what she'd witnessed at the burial, could not dismiss these accounts. She began sneaking into the churchyard at night, holding a lantern and standing near Eleanor's grave. I felt her, Sarah wrote in a letter to her sister, not in the way we feel ghosts or memories, but as though her presence was still there, desperate and trapped. I am terrified that we buried her alive. The Whitlock family, however, would hear none of it. Charles Whitlock grew particularly hostile toward anyone who brought up the rumors. The dead are dead, he snapped at a group of townsmen who dared to ask if the grave should be checked. Do you think I'd allow my bride to rot in the dirt if she wasn't truly gone? His tone was so sharp and cold that most dared not press further, yet fear gripped the town. In a place like Ravenshade, superstition spread quickly. Mothers began telling their children not to go near the churchyard after dark. Some whispered that Eleanor's spirit was restless, cursed to wander because her life had been stolen from her on the day it was meant to begin. Others believed she was clawing her way toward revenge, not from beyond the grave, but from beneath it. One particularly chilling account came from the gravedigger, Thomas. He claimed that late one evening, while passing by Eleanor's grave, he saw the earth disturbed, as though something had shifted below. I swear on my life, he told a tavern full of wide-eyed listeners, that mound wasn't flat no more. It looked like something had pushed from underneath. Was it just the settling of the earth? Or had the bride, entombed in her wedding gown, tried to claw her way out? The whispers only grew louder, both in the town and in the imaginations of those who feared they had witnessed a terrible mistake. What none of them knew was that the truth, the horrifying truth, was about to come to light. Ravenshade's uneasy silence shattered one cold morning, nearly 2 weeks after Eleanor Whitlock's burial. The town awoke to a sight that would haunt its collective memory for decades. The freshly filled earth of Eleanor's grave had been disturbed. A group of local children, daring each other to venture near the cemetery's edge, had discovered the mound's cracked soil, the earth uneven and broken as if something beneath was struggling to break free. Word spread like wildfire. The disturbed grave became the subject of whispered conversations in every household, the topic of hushed debates in the saloon, and the source of restless nights for many. Charles Whitlock was incensed. He summoned the town's leaders and declared that any talk of the grave's disturbance was malicious gossip aimed at sullying the Whitlock name. He demanded the grave be immediately reburied and secured, warning that anyone caught spreading such nonsense would face harsh consequences. But despite Charles's threats, the rumors would not be quelled. Sarah Finch, the maid of honor, was among those who insisted the disturbance was no accident. She swore that Eleanor's hand had been seen clawing through the dirt before the earth was hastily shoveled back into place. In a letter written years later, Sarah recounted, "When I saw the broken earth, my heart nearly stopped. It was as if Eleanor had fought to live, to breathe again beneath that coffin lid. I fear what it means, that she was buried before death truly claimed her." The town doctor, Dr. Jonathan Alcott, was called upon to investigate. Though untrained in forensic science by modern standards, he approached the grave with a clinical eye. He noted the disturbed soil, but claimed it was likely caused by the relentless rain and the settling of loose earth. Yet even he could not explain the faint scratch marks on the wooden coffin lid, marks too deliberate to be made by tree roots or animals. More chillingly, during the grave's reopening, those present reported a faint but unmistakable odor rising from the coffin, a metallic scent reminiscent of blood and earth, mingled with the faintest hint of decay. It was a smell that confirmed what no one dared speak aloud. Eleanor's final moments had been far from peaceful. The news spread beyond Ravenshade, attracting the attention of curious historians and morbid thrill-seekers who speculated wildly about what had transpired beneath the soil. Some believed Eleanor had been a victim of premature burial, a fate feared across frontier towns where medical knowledge was limited and superstitions rife. Others whispered of darker forces, curses born from family secrets, of blood debts paid in full by the bride. The Whitlock family's reputation took a hit, and with it their power over Ravenshade began to wane. Neighbors who once bowed to their authority now glanced warily at the family's estate, murmuring of ghostly apparitions and restless spirits. The chapel itself was avoided after sunset, the flicker of candlelight behind its windows seen as a sinister glow. Whether caused by natural forces or something far more sinister, the disturbance of Eleanor's grave opened a door that Ravenshade could never close. The line between life and death blurred, and the dead bride's story became a whispered warning to all who dared to forget the fragile boundary between the two. Beneath the fading grandeur of the Whitlock estate, shadows gathered darker than the Texas twilight. As rumors of Eleanor's disturbed grave spread, so too did whispers about the family herself, whispers that suggested the Whitlocks harbored secrets far more sinister than the tragedy of a buried bride. Samuel Whitlock, Eleanor's father, was a man known for his wealth and influence, but also for his iron-fisted control over Ravenshade. Behind the veneer of a respected rancher, those close to the family spoke of a patriarch obsessed with power and preservation of the Whitlock legacy, no matter the cost. His dealings often skirted the law, and some claimed he dabbled in practices that the church would condemn. Histories uncovered and recently found letters and ledgers hint at Samuel's involvement in occult rituals intended to protect his family's fortune. One journal, belonging to a former family servant, described secret midnight gatherings held deep in the estate's cellar, where whispered chants mingled with the scent of burning sage and strange symbols carved into wooden beams. The servant wrote, "The master seeks favor from dark forces. He fears the curse that follows his bloodline. Eleanor's fate is tied to these shadows." More troubling were the rumors of family discord, tales of Eleanor's mother, Martha, who was said to be deeply fearful of Samuel's intentions. Local lore claimed that Martha often pleaded for Eleanor's safety, but was silenced by her husband's cold resolve. Some neighbors spoke of hearing heated arguments through the walls, followed by eerie silences that seemed to suffocate the household. Even Charles Whitlock, the cold groom, was enmeshed in the family's web of secrets. His arrival in Ravenshade had been met with suspicion. He was not simply a cousin, but rumored to be a man with debts and enemies elsewhere. Marrying Eleanor was seen by some as a calculated move to solidify his position and control over the Whitlock wealth, regardless of the cost to the young bride. Genealogical records uncovered decades later show a disturbing pattern. Unexplained deaths, disappearances, and sudden illnesses plagued the Whitlock line for generations. Children born under strange circumstances, family members who vanished without a trace, and whispered accusations of madness painted a portrait of a cursed lineage, one desperate to contain its dark history behind locked doors and whispered prayers. Perhaps most chillingly, a letter surfaced from a remorseful servant named Agnes, dated just days before Eleanor's wedding. In it, Agnes begged for mercy for the young bride, hinting that Eleanor had been marked for sacrifice to protect the family's power. The letter was unsigned and hidden away, but it read, "They say she must be bound in white, sealed in death, so that the bloodline may not falter. Pray for her soul, for what is done cannot be undone." The Whitlock family secrets had been buried for years, but the tragic tale of Eleanor Whitlock began to unravel those carefully constructed walls of silence. Behind the veil of respectability lay a history steeped in fear, control, and darkness, one that would haunt Ravenshade long after the earth had settled over the bride's grave. In the summer of 1840, nearly 2 years after Eleanor Whitlock's tragic burial, Ravenshade's uneasy silence was broken by the arrival of a stranger. His name was Dr. Elijah Mercer, a historian and medical scholar from New Orleans with a reputation for probing the dark corners of forgotten stories, especially those where medicine and mystery intertwined. Dr. Mercer was a man of sharp intellect and quiet determination. He had heard rumors of Eleanor Whitlock's case during his travels through Texas, and what intrigued him most was the unsettling suggestion of premature burial, a terrifying but not unheard of fate in the 19th century, when medical knowledge was limited and death was often declared prematurely. Upon arriving in Ravenshade, Mercer wasted no time. He immediately sought out the surviving members of the Whitlock household, town elders, and anyone who might shed light on the grim events surrounding the bride. His demeanor was professional, but there was an intensity behind his calm gaze that unsettled even the most guarded townsfolk. Locals were suspicious of Mercer's probing questions. Some viewed him as an outsider meddling in affairs best left buried. Others whispered that he was a harbinger of scandal, threatening to expose the Whitlock family's darkest secrets. Yet a few, Sarah Finch among them, saw in him a glimmer of hope, someone brave enough to confront the shadows that had long haunted their town. Dr. Mercer's investigation began with the chapel itself. He examined every inch of the floorboards, the hidden chest, and the now crumbling walls. Using rudimentary tools and his keen eye, he documented signs of hastily concealed evidence, the broken latch on a hidden compartment, fragments of lace stained with a dark substance, and faint impressions in the wood consistent with something heavy being stored beneath. He interviewed Dr. Jonathan Alcott, the town physician, pressing him for details on Eleanor's condition and the procedures used to declare her dead. Alcott was defensive but revealed that he had never been fully convinced of Eleanor's passing. The primitive medical practices of the time left much to doubt, and Alcott confessed to a lingering guilt he could never shake. Mercer's most important meeting, however, was with Sarah Finch. She provided him with her letters and first-hand accounts of the wedding day, the burial, and the strange occurrences that followed. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of a young bride caught in a web of fear and secrecy. As Mercer pieced together the fragments of Eleanor's story, he began to uncover inconsistencies, discrepancies in timelines, missing documents, and evasive answers from the Whitlock family. These raised disturbing questions about what truly happened that stormy day in 1838. What Dr. Mercer did not yet know was that his quest for truth would put him on a dangerous path, one that threatened to unravel not only the Whitlock legacy, but also the very fabric of Ravenshade itself. As Dr. Elijah Mercer delved deeper into the shadows of the Whitlock family, the unsettling pieces began to fall into place, and with them came a chilling revelation. Eleanor Whitlock's death was no tragic accident, but a carefully orchestrated murder. Mercer's investigation uncovered evidence that the bride's collapse was induced, not by illness or exhaustion, but by a slow-acting poison administered in the days before the wedding. Hidden correspondence between members of the Whitlock household, discovered in the secret compartment beneath the chapel floor, contained coded warnings and cryptic messages alluding to silencing the fragile one and securing the family's future at any cost. Dr. Mercer confronted surviving witnesses with this new evidence. Sarah Finch's letters described Eleanor's increasing fear and physical decline, corroborating the notion that she had been weakened intentionally. More shocking were confessions from a remorseful servant named Agnes, whose letter, uncovered among the Whitlock archives, detailed her coerced participation in administering the poison under threat of death. Agnes wrote, "They said it was for the good of the family, that the bloodline must remain strong, and Eleanor's weakness was a threat. I gave her the tincture in her morning tea. She did not deserve this fate." The motive was grimly clear. Eleanor's marriage to Charles was not born of love but of greed and control. Her untimely death ensured that the Whitlock estate and its dark secrets remained tightly in the family's grip. Moreover, Mercer found evidence suggesting the burial was rushed not just because of the storm, but to hide the truth of Eleanor's murder. The sealed coffin, hastily nailed shut, prevented anyone from seeing the telltale signs of poisoning or struggle. The suspicious marks on the coffin lid, the disturbed earth, and the reports of faint noises after burial hinted at a desperate attempt to conceal the crime beneath layers of dirt and silence. Mercer's findings ignited a firestorm in Ravenshade. Some townsfolk were horrified to learn of the deception, while others whispered that the Whitlocks' grip on the town was more sinister than anyone dared imagine. The revelation of murder transformed Eleanor's story from a tragic death into a dark tale of betrayal, power, and cold-blooded ambition. But even as the truth came to light, Mercer knew this was only the beginning. For every secret uncovered, more questions lingered, questions that, if answered, could shake the very foundations of Ravenshade and expose horrors yet unseen. The revelation of Eleanor Whitlock's murder sent shockwaves through Ravenshade, turning the once powerful Whitlock family from revered landowners into pariahs in their own town. Dr. Elijah Mercer's painstaking investigation laid bare a legacy of cruelty, manipulation, and cold ambition, one that the townsfolk could no longer ignore or tolerate. As word spread, neighbors who had once bowed to the Whitlocks' influence began to openly question their authority. Merchants refused to do business with Charles Whitlock. Ranch hands abandoned the estate under the cover of darkness. Even some family members distanced themselves, fearful that the dark stain of Eleanor's death would forever taint their name. Local authorities, pressured by mounting public outrage in Mercer's evidence, launched formal inquiries. Although the legal system in frontier Texas was slow and imperfect, it could no longer turn a blind eye to such a blatant case of murder and abuse of power. Charles Whitlock, once a man of cold calculation, found himself isolated and vulnerable. His attempts to dismiss the accusations as baseless gossip were met with skepticism, especially as more witnesses came forward, servants who had long lived in fear now willing to speak, and townsfolk who had seen unsettling behavior within the Whitlock household. Samuel Whitlock, the patriarch, was rumored to have fallen into a deep, brooding silence, reportedly wandering the estate grounds at night muttering of curses and lost honor. His health deteriorated rapidly, as if the weight of his family's sins was manifesting in his body. In a final act of defiance and despair, Charles fled Ravenshade under cover of night, leaving behind his lands and a tarnished legacy. Some say he disappeared into the vast Texas wilderness, never to be seen again. Others believe darker forces caught up with him, retribution for the blood he had spilled. The Whitlock estate itself fell into disrepair, the grand house becoming a crumbling relic swallowed by wild vines and shadow. Locals avoided the property, convinced it was cursed, a place where the past's horrors lingered in the broken windows and shattered floorboards. Yet the downfall of the Whitlocks was more than the collapse of a family. It was a reckoning for Ravenshade itself. The town had been complicit in silence, in fear, in turning away from the suffering of one of its own. Eleanor's story became a symbol of that injustice, a reminder that beneath the surface of respectability, darkness can fester and consume. As Dr. Mercer prepared to leave Ravenshade, he reflected on the cost of truth. The lives ruined, the trust shattered, and the long shadows cast by a bride buried alive in more ways than one. Even after the Whitlock family's downfall and the decay of their estate, the story of Eleanor Whitlock refused to fade into silence. In Ravenshade, whispers persisted, not just about the murder and betrayal, but about something far darker, the restless spirit of the bride herself. Locals claimed that on certain moonless nights, a pale figure draped in a tattered wedding gown could be seen wandering the edges of the cemetery, her veil fluttering like a ghostly flame. Those who dared approach spoke of a chilling coldness that clung to the air, a silence broken only by soft, sorrowful sobs carried on the wind. One farmer recounted a terrifying encounter. While tending his fields late at night, he saw a woman standing beside the broken iron gate of the Whitlock estate. Her face was hidden beneath a veil stained with dirt and tears. As he stepped closer, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble, and a sudden gust extinguished his lantern. When he relit it, she had vanished without a trace. Sarah Finch, haunted by guilt and grief, was among the first to believe Eleanor's spirit lingered. She often visited the grave, speaking softly to the earth as though offering comfort. She never rested, Sarah once wrote. Her soul is trapped between worlds, bound by betrayal and the injustice of being buried alive. The local reverend, Father Langston, reluctantly acknowledged these tales. Though a man of faith, he confessed to hearing footsteps echoing in the chapel late at night, footsteps that ceased abruptly as if something unseen fled at his approach. He warned the townsfolk to pray for Eleanor's soul, lest her anguish grow into vengeance. Folklore soon entwined Eleanor's story with warnings. Parents used the tale of the buried bride to caution children against wandering alone at night, and travelers passing through Ravenshade avoided the cemetery after dark, fearful of encountering the bride's ghostly apparition. Paranormal investigators visiting decades later recorded inexplicable phenomena, cold spots, faint weeping captured on audio devices, and shadowy figures glimpsed in photographs. Though skeptics dismissed these as tricks of light and imagination, the believers argued that Eleanor's spirit remained tethered to the place where her life was so cruelly cut short. The bride's restless spirit became a symbol of unresolved injustice, a reminder that some wounds, especially those inflicted by betrayal and fear, transcend death. Her story lives on in Ravenshade's collective memory, a ghostly echo of love, loss, and a life stolen too soon. Decades after Eleanor Whitlock's tragic tale faded into local legend, a startling discovery reignited interest in the macabre history of the bride buried in her wedding dress. In 2019, during renovations on the old Whitlock estate, long abandoned and overtaken by wild brush, workers unearthed a hidden cellar beneath the crumbling floorboards of the main house. Inside, sealed in a rusted iron chest, were bundles of yellowed documents, journals, and letters, some written in a shaky hand, others typed with the rudimentary typewriter of the late 19th century. These papers contained chilling first-hand accounts from the Whitlock household staff, detailed notes on family rituals, and disturbing confessions never before revealed to the public. Historians and forensic experts quickly descended upon Ravenshade, eager to examine the archive. Among the documents was a medical ledger kept by Dr. Jonathan Alcott, revealing inconsistencies in Eleanor's death records and noting an unusual heart rhythm described as weak but present shortly before her burial, a fact that suggested she may have been buried alive. Further, letters from Sarah Finch, preserved in exquisite detail, described in haunting prose the sounds she claimed to hear from beneath Eleanor's grave, scratching, muffled cries, and desperate attempts to escape the coffin. These descriptions sparked renewed debates among medical historians about the prevalence of premature burial during the 19th century and the tragic consequences of limited medical knowledge. Adding to the eerie nature of the find were artifacts, pieces of Eleanor's wedding dress, still stained and fragile, and a small, rusted key inscribed with a cryptic symbol matching those found in the family's occult journals. The meaning of this key remains a mystery, fueling speculation about secret chambers and forgotten rituals linked to the Whitlock curse. Local paranormal investigators have also reported an uptick in unexplained activity around the estate and cemetery since the discovery. Equipment recorded sudden drops in temperature, faint whispering voices, and shadows moving against the light, all contributing to the growing legend of Eleanor's restless spirit. This modern discovery has brought new life to an old horror, reminding Ravenshade and the world that some secrets refuse to stay buried. The documents and artifacts have been digitized and placed under archival protection, but rumors persist that many more secrets lie hidden in sealed family records yet to be uncovered. The question remains, what other truths about Eleanor Whitlock's death and the Whitlock family's dark legacy have yet to see the light of day? Even after years of investigation, discovery, and unsettling revelations, the story of Eleanor Whitlock leaves more questions than answers. Questions that continue to haunt Ravenshade and everyone drawn into the tragic mystery of the bride buried in her wedding dress. How did a young woman, radiant and full of hope on the morning of her wedding, come to be sealed alive beneath the earth? Was it a cruel mistake born of fear and ignorance, or a calculated act of murder cloaked in tradition and greed? Despite Dr. Mercer's findings, no official record or confession fully confirms the truth, leaving an open wound in the town's history. What exactly transpired in those final hours between Eleanor's collapse and her burial? The inconsistencies in witness testimonies, the suspicious haste of the burial, and the eerie disturbances at her grave suggest something darker than a simple medical error. Was Eleanor conscious but unable to signal for help? Did she try to escape her fate in terror? The Whitlock family's involvement raises deeper questions about the nature of power and sacrifice. What secrets did they seek to bury along with Eleanor? Were there others, perhaps victims whose stories were erased or forgotten, to whom similar fates were meted out in the name of preserving family legacy and control? The mysterious symbols and rituals uncovered in the family's hidden archives invite speculation about occult influences and curses. Did these forces play a role in Eleanor's death? Or are they merely the desperate delusions of a family trying to protect itself from scandal and misfortune? And what of Eleanor's restless spirit? Is it a manifestation of guilt and grief in the collective consciousness, or something more tangible? Could her lingering presence be a warning to those who dare disturb the past or ignore the cries of the forgotten? Modern-day discoveries have opened new doors, but they have also deepened the mystery. Many of the Whitlock documents remain sealed or lost, and rumors persist of secret family chambers yet to be explored. What truths might lie buried still, waiting for the brave or the curious to uncover? Ultimately, Eleanor's story is a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the consequences of silence and secrecy. It challenges us to ask difficult questions about justice, memory, and the lengths to which people will go to protect their own. As the sun sets over Ravenshade and shadows lengthen across the old cemetery, one question echoes louder than all others. What secrets remain buried beneath the soil and in the hearts of those left behind? Tonight we have journeyed through the chilling tale of Eleanor Whitlock, the bride buried in her wedding dress, whose story of betrayal, murder, and restless spirits still haunts the shadows of 1838 Texas. From the eerie midnight burial to the unearthing of dark family secrets, This tale reveals how power, fear, and desperation can twist love into something sinister. Eleanor's fate is a grim reminder of the dangers hidden beneath the surface of respectability. Her story exposes the tragic consequences of silence and the lengths to which some will go to protect their legacy, even at the cost of innocent lives. The Whitlock's downfall and the lingering hauntings speak to the lasting impact of injustice and the need for truth, no matter how dark it may be. But many questions remain unanswered. Was Eleanor truly buried alive? What other secrets does the Whitlock family still hold? And what does her restless spirit want from us? These mysteries invite us to reflect not just on history, but on how we confront uncomfortable truths today. If this story has chilled you, unsettled you, or made you think twice about the shadows and forgotten corners, then you're exactly the kind of brave soul who belongs here. This story isn't for everyone, only those willing to face the darkest chapters of history and human nature. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you believe really happened to Eleanor Whitlock? Could justice have been served, or is her spirit doomed to wander forever? Drop your theories, experiences, or questions in the comments below. Your voice is part of this story now. If you want to dive deeper into more forbidden histories, dark family secrets, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. We uncover truths others fear to tell, peeling back the layers of time to reveal what lurks beneath. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, some secrets refuse to stay buried.